Syracuse football lost a couple of key players in the spring transfer portal, like Trebor Pena and Marrad Watson, but it seems like they actually did a solid job in replacing those guys.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day, and of course, we're always free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are going to discuss an article from CBS Sports' Chip Patterson earlier this week, ACC Football Spring Overreactions. Chip Patterson went through each and every one of the teams in the ACC, and he provided an overreaction. And since Syracuse is in the ACC, well, the Orange were certainly mentioned in the article. We'll discuss whether or not Syracuse is in a good spot or a bad spot for the upcoming 2025 college football season, which, by the way, at the time of this recording, which is Wednesday, May 14th, we are exactly 108 days until Syracuse's season opener against Tennessee, which will be a noon kickoff, by the way. It was recently announced. We'll also discuss some of the glaring omissions in the article. Did Chip Patterson really forget to mention Marrad Watson? Spoiler alert, he did, as one of the key losses for Syracuse football, and also the NFL talent that they recently sent in the draft just a couple of weeks ago. But first, we're going to get into the overreaction itself, which is that Syracuse did a nice job allocating its resources following the loss of Trebor Pena. All that and more here on this edition of Locked On Syracuse. Now, before we get to everything, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. This topic of conversation was actually going to be discussed in depth on the ACC squad this week, but unfortunately, there will not be an ACC squad this week. It should return the following week. That being said, since we can't discuss it on the ACC squad, let's talk about it here. And since this is Locked On Syracuse, this is a Syracuse show, and I am clearly biased to Syracuse because I'm a Syracuse fan and a Syracuse alum, well, who cares about the other teams in the ACC? Let's talk about the overreaction from Chip Patterson when discussing Syracuse football. Now, the headline of the article for Syracuse is this, quote, "Profit-loss ratio from spring portal puts Orange in a good spot," end quote. The article then goes on for a couple of paragraphs saying that Syracuse did a nice job allocating its resources following the departure of Trebor Pena, which at this point, I guess it's sunken in basically for everyone that Trebor Pena, while it was shocking at the time, it is what it is. He's with Penn State now. In fact, there's actually a quote at the end of the Syracuse section of the article, which is that Syracuse might have lost some of the high-end individual skill of Pena, but they also got deeper and better at some key positions in the spring window. And I'll just toss it to you right now. What are your thoughts? Okay. Do you think that Syracuse did a nice job allocating its resources following the loss of Trebor Pena? I want to hear from you in the comments section below. Here's my number one takeaway from this. This is not an overreaction. Okay. It is not an overreaction to say that Syracuse did a nice job using its resources that it had following the loss of Trebor Pena. First of all, if you're looking for a more one-for-one replacement, it's 2023 five-star former Texas and Washington wide receiver Johntay Cook, who has a big pedigree from high school, former five-star guy, hasn't exactly lived up to expectations so far, and Syracuse is really going to be his last chance in college football. But hey, I would say that's a pretty solid replacement for Trebor Pena, right? I don't know if he's going to be all ACC, but I think he's got the talent to do it, like Pena did. And he can also play the slot. He can play outside. So if you're looking for that one-for-one comparison, well, they did a pretty decent job getting Johntay Cook, right? Well, I mean, what do you think? Comment your thoughts in the comment section below. Really, with Cook, it is a boomer bust type deal. This is either going to be a fantastic move that we'll talk about for years, or it's going to be one of those moves that will be disastrous, and we'll also talk about it for years, even though we'll try to forget about it. What else did Syracuse do in the spring portal? Starting job with LSU transfer Ricky Collins. And then they also signed 4 offensive linemen in the spring portal following the loss of Trebor Pena. You get Austin Collins from Louisville, you get Cam Pringle from South Carolina, you get Zach Rice from North Carolina, and you get TJ Ferguson from Florida State. And oh, by the way, if that's not good enough for you, well, I should mention that Syracuse still has a couple of scholarships remaining, at least according to 24/7 Sports Syracuse insider Mike McAllister in his scholarship tracker that he does. And that is assuming that the scholarship limit is increased to 105. So basically, they still can add if they so choose at this point. Really, what this article reminded me of is what happened over the winter with Kyle McCord in terms of allocating resources. What do I mean by that? Well, remember when Kyle McCord was trying to get that 5th year of college eligibility? Remember that? Seems like it was forever ago, but it was literally last December and last January when he was trying to get that 5th year. And we'll never know if he was actually going to get it or not from the NCAA because he decided to just screw it and enter the NFL draft. And it seems to work out for him because he got picked in the 6th round by the Philadelphia Eagles, right? But Syracuse, they did have to prepare in case that Kyle McCord did return to Syracuse football, aka they needed to have the money in place. Because if Kyle McCord was granted another year and said, I want to come back to college football, if he entered the transfer portal and went elsewhere, I think we all would have lost our minds. So clearly, Syracuse football had to be ready with the right amount of money that would have been able to keep a guy like Kyle McCord had he been eligible to return to college football. Obviously, he does not return. So what does that mean? Well, all that money that you had for Kyle McCord is now available to be used elsewhere, right? And so we talked about that actually on a podcast. Now, relating it back to Trebor Pena, Syracuse obviously had money set aside for Trebor Pena because he was supposed to be on the team. Well, then he enters the transfer portal. You can use that money in other ways. So overall, I do agree with Chip Patterson, and I don't believe it's an overreaction to say that, hey, Syracuse football did a nice job allocating the resources that it had following the loss of Trebor Pena. What are your thoughts in the comments section below? Do you think Syracuse football recovered successfully after they lost Pena in the portal? I want to hear from you in the comments section below. That being said, while the article was very complimentary of Syracuse football, which is nice, it does have a couple of flaws, which we'll talk about next here on Locked On Syracuse. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action, and FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And the New York Knicks are up 3-1 at the time of this recording against the Boston Celtics, and unfortunately, it's really unfortunate that Jason Tatum is now out for the rest of the playoffs and probably going to bleed into next season with a torn Achilles. But as far as this series is concerned, I mean, the New York Knicks are looking pretty good right now. Do you think they're going to go all the way to the NBA Finals? Well, you can bet it on FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, well, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and once again, we are discussing Chip Patterson of CBS Sports, his article, ACC Football Spring Overreactions, and what he had to say about the Orange, which is that they did a nice job spending its resources elsewhere following the loss of Trebor Pena. And we dove into, in the first segment, why A, it's not an overreaction, and B, why I agree with Chip Patterson. And I throw it to you as well. If you agree or disagree, comment your thoughts in the comments section below. That being said, there's a couple of flaws with it. And we should mention that here on Locked On Syracuse because this is a Syracuse show. No Marrad Watson mentioned in the article. And I've read it a couple of times. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need glasses. That's fine. I didn't see Marrad Watson's name there. A 2024 true freshman, All-American defensive tackle for Syracuse last year, was not mentioned in the article, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. He was a spring transfer portal addition. Am I missing something? I don't think I am. I remember doing that mini podcast talking about how Marrad Watson left in the transfer portal because I did it right after a family dinner. I remember that, and then I released it in the morning for you all, I believe. So he was definitely a spring portal addition. He was a true freshman All-American, and Chip Patterson fails to mention him as one of the big losses for Syracuse football. That's not to say that they did a horrible job replacing him, but, I mean, you might want to mention him. He went to Texas for a boatload of NIL. He was clearly tampered with. You had other programs like Ohio State also involved. I think Georgia was involved as well. He was a pretty big deal. You can make an argument that he was more of a big deal than a guy like Trebor Pena going to Penn State. So how did Syracuse replace Marrad Watson in the spring portal? Well, they did get a defensive tackle, and it was from Boston College, a veteran in George Rooks. And we have actually a full podcast talking about George Rooks and the defensive line. But the positive about George Rooks is that he was a Power 4 starter a year ago. And those don't necessarily grow on trees. A Power 4 starter. However, last year, George Rooks had a Pro Football Focus grade of 51. And for those that don't understand Pro Football Focus, it grades players on a scale of 0 to 100, the higher number being better. And a grade of 51 is considered to be below average. For more context, Marrad Watson, his run defense specifically, was given an 82.6 grade. So he is one of the better run defenders in the nation. So did Syracuse improve going from Marrad Watson to George Rooks? Probably not. However, I don't see it as that big of a deal. I just think that if you're going to write an article about, hey, spring overreaction, Syracuse did a nice job allocating its resources, you might want to mention a guy like Marrad Watson. And also, no NFL talent mentioned. No NFL talent mentioned here. You're not going to mention how Syracuse had sent over 10 players to the NFL. I'm not saying this to be negative, by the way. I'm just saying this is a reality. It's actually a really good thing when your program sends a lot of players to the National Football League. You know why? Because recruits see that, and that helps you get them. Because they want to know if they have a future or not playing professionally. So sending guys to the league is a good thing, but the reality is that the team lost a lot of talent from a year ago. Kyle McCord's gone. Aronde Gadsden, LaQuinn Allen, Jackson Meeks, Savion Washington, Fidel Diggs, Elijah Clark, Clarence Lewis, Justin Barron, Marlo Wax. Players that were, at minimum, talented enough to be signed as undrafted free agents basically right away, which shows you that maybe they could have been drafted after all. And 4 of those players were actually drafted in the NFL draft. Obviously, like I mentioned with Power 4 starters not growing on trees, well, guess what? NFL talent definitely does not grow on trees either. I guess what helps Syracuse in this regard is that the coaching staff, as far as the big 3 coaches, are the same from a year ago. Your head coach is still Fran Brown. Your offensive coordinator is still Jeff Nixon, and your defensive coordinator is Elijah Robinson. Now, obviously, we know the importance of Fran Brown as the head coach, but I also think it really helps that the offensive coordinator from a year ago and Jeff Nixon is obviously still here because Syracuse had one of the top offenses in the entire nation last season. So maybe he can work his magic again, just with a whole different set of personnel. It's going to be a brand new quarterback. Yeah, you'll have Daryl Gill, but now it's going to be Johntay Cook. Guys stepping up that didn't have to do it as much a year ago at the receiver spot. Your running back's going to be completely different. Your offensive line's completely different. But hey, you still got Jeff Nixon, so we'll see how much that offense works next year. Not saying that to be positive or negative, by the way. It's just a genuine question that I have. You also got, obviously, Elijah Robinson back, and he's a great recruiter. Wasn't necessarily the greatest defensive coordinator a year ago. 12th in the ACC in total defenses, rush 3, drop 8 sets were really annoying, especially at the end of the Stanford game, which we don't have to get into. But overall, it does help that the coaching staff, the big 3 coaches, remain for Syracuse football. So hopefully they got the right players needed for their systems. I mean, do you think that Syracuse is in a good spot or a bad spot for this upcoming season? I want to hear from you in the comments section below after basically all the moves that they have done so far. And speaking of which, that's what we're going to talk about here on the final segment. Is Syracuse in a good spot or a bad spot for the 2025 college football season? That's coming up next on Locked On Syracuse. Is Syracuse football in a good spot for the 2025 season, or are they in a bad spot for the 2025 season? How about this? I don't think they're in a bad spot looking ahead to 2025. I also don't necessarily think they're in a good spot either. So you might be thinking, well, Jackson, do you just fall in the middle? No. I think they're in a very weird spot. This is my thought on Syracuse football right now. They are one of the toughest teams in the ACC, if not the country, to project. Because there's a lot of optimism, including from myself, about this coaching staff. A lot of optimism after a tremendous first season. However, we talked about this in the last segment. They lost a lot of talent. They lost a lot of key players from a year ago. So did they really do a good job in replacing them? I guess we'll find out, right? But at least on paper right now, looking at the roster compared to last year, what I will say is I don't know if it's better or worse, but it's definitely not as proven from a year ago. A year ago, you had some breakouts. Jackson Meeks was the big one that broke out. But LaQuinn Allen, you knew, was a proven guy. You knew that Oronde Gadsden was a proven guy. And you also knew that Kyle McCord was a proven guy. You knew that Kyle McCord was most likely going to have a good year. Now, obviously, a lot of people around the country may have underestimated him from his time at Ohio State. But if you had been following along Locked On Syracuse, I think you would have had fair expectations for Kyle McCord. And he actually ended up exceeding those expectations. But roster-wise, the team that went 9-3 a year ago looks unrecognizable. They are a completely different team. It's just the coaching staff remains largely the same. And then you got to get into the schedule as well. And that's another big reason why it is so difficult to gauge Syracuse for 2025. And I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up the schedule here. It's the elephant in the room. We have to talk about it. It just has to be brought up because, like it or not, these are the games that are on Syracuse's schedule. They're going to play these teams. Week 1 neutral site, you're playing Tennessee. You also got to go to Clemson. You got to go to SMU. You got to go to Miami. You got to go at Georgia Tech, at Notre Dame. Now, I have given this comparison for Syracuse football before, but I think it's been a while since I have mentioned it. And to be honest with you all, we've actually grown tremendously since I believe the last time I've mentioned this. So thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you to all those who continue to subscribe. I get this weird feeling that Syracuse football could be kind of like Georgia Tech from a year ago. Now, if you recall Georgia Tech in 2024, they went 7-5. But I don't believe they were a 7-5 team. I believe they were more 8-4, 9-3 on paper. But they went 7-5 in large part because of the schedule. They had to play at Syracuse. They played at Louisville. They played Notre Dame. They played Miami at home, which they actually won that game. And they also went to Georgia, and they lost that game in 8 overtimes. That game just would not end, but they still lost. And so that was one of the main reasons why Georgia Tech, which was a really good team, didn't really have much of a chance to compete for an ACC championship because the schedule makers, the schedule gods out there just gave them a brutal one. They gave them a brutal one. And so if Syracuse, think of it this way, if they go 7-5 next year, that means they won at least one of these games that I mentioned earlier, which is at Notre Dame, at Georgia Tech, at Miami, at SMU, at Clemson, Tennessee neutral site, because that's 6 games right there. So if you go 7-5, you beat one of those teams. So the main takeaway is that it is just so difficult to get a read on this team. It really is. Last year, I felt good about my prediction. I said, hey, best case scenario regular season, they'll go 10-2. Worst case, 6-6. So I split the difference and I said 8-4. They end up going 9-3. So they did even better than I thought. This year, I legitimately don't know. I mean, I could see them going 9-3 again. I could. I can be optimistic. I can sell you on 9-3 right now. I could sit here and try to tell you that, hey, Steve Angeli was good at Notre Dame. He just could never get an opportunity. He's going to be really good in Jeff Nixon's offense. Johntay Cook is going to break out. So they're once again going to be one of the elite offenses in college football. And they're just going to be scoring 40 points a game. And it's going to be very difficult for even some of the top teams to beat a team like Syracuse football. They're going 9-3 once again. Then there's the flip side to it, which is that, hey, what if they don't get good quarterback play this year? Because Kyle McCord is not throwing footballs for Syracuse. He's not walking through that door again. And the schedule just becomes overwhelming. Well, then what? It's on the table that they don't make a bowl. There's a reason why our friends over at FanDuel have Syracuse's over-under at 5.5 wins. I actually think it's more of a sign of respect because think about it this way. I've said this before too. If Dino Babers was the head coach of Syracuse football right now, he was the prior coach before Fran Brown, there's no way that they would have an over-under of 5.5. Looking at this schedule, it would be like 3.5 or 4.5 maybe. But they're getting a decent amount of respect. You're actually seeing people put Syracuse in early top 25s too. I posted it on Twitter at @LO_Syracuse that it was very interesting seeing Syracuse as a top 25 team in the nation. And Tennessee wasn't even on the list. How about that? So I guess there's a reason why the games are played, and we are over 100 days into the college football season. So we'll see. We'll find out. But what do you think? Are they in a good spot, bad spot, weird spot? Can you predict them? Can you not predict them? I want to hear your thoughts, your outlook of Syracuse football this upcoming season in the comments section below. Again, my takeaway is this. I can't get a read. I can't really get a gauge on this team. We're really going to find out, I think, week 1 against Tennessee. But I would love to hear from you in the comments section below if you believe that Syracuse is going to be really good or if you think they're going to be really bad, because it could go either way. As far as what's coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future, well, all the other plans that I previously got pushed back today, right? So tomorrow we'll discuss the importance level of every Syracuse basketball transfer portal edition. On Friday, we got Poll Friday, grading Syracuse basketball's transfer portal class. And then on Saturday, we got the role of every Syracuse basketball returning player and freshman. So that's what's coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future. And thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. Now, for your second listen, you might want to check out the Locked On Portal Show with football recruiting expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors and signings each and every day. Miami actually just recently picked up the #1 recruit in the nation. So if you're interested in stuff like that, well, check out the Locked On Portal Show with Brian Smith because he's been covering it tremendously over the last day or so. And you can be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. Find the Portal Show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe. Tell all your friends about Locked On Syracuse and make sure you turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. And I will see you all again soon.